What scientific breakthroughs could we expect in the future without ethics? Story 1. As a medical scientist, I feel that I can say with a fair amount of confidence that vaccine research would be sped up by about 1000% if we were allowed to perform experiments on animals and people in the most efficient way possible. In fact, all of infectious disease research would make a huge leap forward. Mouse models are pretty much all we are left with, now that it is close to impossible to experiment on primates due to ethical restrictions. And mice are terrible models for human disease. On top of this, the amount of any animal research we can do is very limited because it is insanely expensive to keep the mice the humane way we are now required to do by law with round-the-clock care and professional vets on call at all times. And even though the circumstances are luxurious compared to the cheap and dirty ways we did it before, I wouldn't really say it was a great life for a mouse, even if they weren't part of medical research. Plus, because of the threat of animal rights terrorists, the amount of money we need to build the bunkers to encase these animal facilities is enormous. There are actually many outstanding questions in infectious disease research that are holding the entire field back on particular diseases because we simply can't do the experiments needed to resolve them within ethical restrictions. Story 2: Cloning. Whenever I find a hair in my food or on my shirt or desk that most definitely isn't mine, I have the specific urge to take the hair and extract the genetic material and breed a clone that I will raise up until the age that I can determine exactly whose hair it was, thus abandoning their clone on their doorstep, giving them the financial burden of raising it, all out of spite for their strand of hair, inconveniencing me. Story 3. Lots of advances in psychology. I came here to say that. When I was studying psych, a lot of the time professors would joke that we don't have much data on that because of the ethical side. One that stays with me is the result of having toddlers grow up in complete isolation without human stimuli. VS with human stimuli. Edit. As this blew up for some reason, let me be clearer. Growing up in utter and total isolation from human stimuli is different from most feral children, because it would also mean the absence of active abuse, only passive, because of the lack of physical love. The other issue is that we have no documentation about how they were brought up, and a handful of cases done in different locations with various types of parenting is no good for consistent data. What was discussed with my teachers is scientific experimentation, with as many modifiers as possible removed so we can obtain raw data that can be analyzed afterwards, and maybe be used with feral children cases afterwards. Having children in total isolation would make us able to better separate what is nature versus what is nurture, and a whole lot of other data about the early development of children. It would also help us learn if the degradation of health in children if not cared for, can't remember the name, but it's been observed in Eastern Bloc orphanages. Children underdeveloping or getting sick more easily or dying from lack of human contact is acquired from birth or merely developed from early human contact that is later removed. Story 4. If ethics were totally obliterated, you'd probably see a major drop-off in scientific breakthroughs. Why? Because science is difficult, but making up results is easy. With no ethics, you'd see a big uptick in people just faking results to compete for funding. Beyond that, there's a big ethic in science about trying to take an objective view and not just interpreting your results to support your preconceived notions. Without that ethic, people would just be trying to find results to support their views, which leads to inferior research. Similar things happened with the famed German scientific research. There's actually not much useful data there, because most of it was just people finding twisted ways to screw with their research subjects rather than doing controlled trials and taking data appropriately, and all those little fiddly, boring things that make research successful. That's a really sharp observation. Science without ethics wouldn't be science at all. It would just be storytelling dressed up in lab coats. If researchers didn't feel bound to honesty, peer review, or methodological rigor, the entire foundation of trust in science collapses. You're right that making up results is infinitely easier than running careful, controlled experiments. Without ethical safeguards, competition for funding and prestige would reward whoever could produce the flashiest claims fastest, not whoever produced the most accurate ones. That's a recipe for pseudoscience becoming mainstream. Story 5. I really want to get a bunch of babies and raise them in an atmosphere where I show them that the way to show happiness is to frown. They would live a semi normal life. I just want to know if the smiling and laughing that humans do is a learned trait or a biological one. My friends don't seem to share my curiosity at it. People are pointing out the blind smile all the same. So I guess what I'm looking at is, what if your world around you was steered into a frown? I guess it spirals from only biological, but could you train a generation to frown while excited? Edit 2. Okay, those pointing out babies smiling and saying it's biological, I understand. But what if these babies lived their entire lives in an atmosphere where frowning was used to show pleasure? Wouldn't eventually the social construct override their natural instincts? Or wouldn't it? That's my thought. Although after having this original thought 10 plus years ago, you all have made me go deeper into the actual experiment than I've ever gone before. Kudos. Story 6. This will probably get buried, but realistically, huge advances in neuroscience and neurology. Right now, the best experiments we can do are run with trained monkeys, which can take months or years to train for one or two specific tasks. Actual intrusive human studies are done almost exclusively with patients who are undergoing brain surgery and consent to take a short period of time while they're opened up to answer some questions while we poke around. Deep brain stimulation in its entirety was discovered by rather unethical experiments on patients in sanitariums back in the 60s and 70s. The Parkinson's implants, as well as a host of other advancements, have their roots in that terrible time. On that note, the actual cerebral tissue responsible for your sense of consciousness. All we can do is tow around with fMRIs and TMS, but once we iron that sucker out, we'll be able to influence your fundamental sense of self. It has serious implications, but how many people ended their life because they hate themselves for things they can't change or control? We could end mental disorders. On that note, what could you do with an implant that lets you control your own sense of motivation? Unfortunately, almost all of the studies that would shed light on these things can only be done in humans, and invasive procedures are almost impossible to get approved for a variety of pretty good reasons. Story 7. I see stem cell research shooting off and possibly giving us the ability to slowly regenerate parts. I see us learning about how the brain works on a much more profound level as well, and genetic makeup being modified as a zygote for the perfect child in some people's eyes. Google iPSC. It's been possible to make stem cells from other cells for a few years already without human embryos, and it's also faster and cheaper. That's why it's become the most common way to produce stem cells. Now the treatments haven't been as groundbreaking as fast as the hype train made them to be, but the development is still positive. Story 8. Asteroid mining. If you throw ethics out the window, aero-breaking mass extinction grade iron-nickel asteroids in the Earth's upper atmosphere becomes a viable option. I'm pretty sure this can be combined with a lunar gravitational assist to achieve Earth orbit without needing a gigantic retrograde burn. Then you can refine and cast the desired rare earth metals, gold, etc., into spheres, cast the waste iron around these spheres to create heat shields, and deorbit the spheres into Antarctica to deliver the materials. This would result in global cooling via suspended dust. But this can be counteracted by releasing the methane from the oceanic methane clathrate beds to create sufficient global warming to offset the cooling. The methane would eventually decompose into less greenhouse-effective carbon dioxide and water in the atmosphere from UV radiation, probably at a rate similar to the settling of the dust. After this whole mess is over and the dust settled, you'd have an absurdly rich mine of rare earth elements in Antarctica and some survivable global warming from carbon dioxide. Story 9. Discover the baseline of humanity. I'd really like to raise a bunch of kids in total absence of culture. Basically, just throw 20 boys and 20 girls onto a deserted island with easily accessible food and no predators. In the beginning, you have them live in a controlled environment with nearby food and water nipples. But every year you move them further away or make them harder to access. By the time they're 10, they'll be climbing trees for bananas and coconuts. By the time they're 20, who knows, they might be hunting and fishing. The truly fascinating thing would be watching how they interact with one another as they grow. we'd learn entirely new things about human reproduction and behavior. Would they segregate themselves by gender? Would their reproduction preferences follow any particular pattern? Or would they just do anything close at hand? What about language? Would they invent their own? Would it be nuanced or basic? How would they respond to pregnancy, puberty, childbirth? There would probably be loads of truly horrible things happening, but it would all be fascinating. Story 10 chimeras, designer plagues, would become a thing, initially developed to eradicate invasive species like rabbits in Australia or snakes in Hawaii. Possibly viral cure agents, I am legend plot, but without the stupid zombie outbreak, for things like malaria and cancer. The trouble being that down that same road to biological power lies its evil side. You could make a slow-acting chimera designed to wipe out huge portions of populations by disguising itself like the common cold and then becoming lethal after 4 years of incubation or minor cold outbreaks to spread itself. You could potentially make a pathogen that targeted specific racial profiles, a genocidal pathogen versus an omnicidal one, and that's a very dark road. The thing is, we suffer from similar developments from nuclear technology. On the one hand, the advent of the atomic bomb may lead to limitless energy eventually, and our society may ascend to the next stage involving control of matter and energy as a result. On the other hand, we might annihilate ourselves by using it as a weapon, as a result of simple greed over resources. Story 11. Unethical pets from for-profit companies may become a thing. Kitten not cute enough for you? How about a neon green one with pink eyes that can't develop claws? Dogs that come pre-trained genetically to have a basic instinct to crap outside? Birds that live as long as you do but fall asleep on command and imprint at multiple points during their lifespans? Similar principles could be applied to humans as well. Babies made with abnormally high metabolic rates to prevent obesity and very specific skin patterns. Rare eye color genetics forced to fruition. Danny has that widow's peak and won't be fruity, just like Daddy wanted. On that note, that's a chilling thought experiment, and it highlights how quickly convenience can slide into commodification of life. At first glance, a cat that doesn't scratch furniture or a dog that never needs house training sounds harmless, even appealing. But once living beings become customizable consumer products, the line between companionship and ownership blurs into manufacturing. Story 12. Improved non-lethal weapons derived from psychological meds. Sick sticks aren't far from this, though it would more likely be an aerosol spray of some kind. Gases that force you to feel relaxed or numb. Valium effect. Drowsy agents. Dizzy bombs and day tripper hallucinogens. And dopamine dumps that force you into a trip with a pleasant high and basically make you useless in armed conflict. All without fear of overdosing. Bad side effect. The milder ones are used even on peaceful protests by authorities to prevent violence from outbreaking. Dark road to thought police and mandatory calming agents. Story 13. Oh, the number one thing that comes to my mind is human cloning. Has anyone watched a Brazilian telenovela, The Clone? O Clone in Portuguese. In that telenovela, a great scientist and an uncle of the main character was the one who succeeded in cloning animals. But then, when the main character's twin brother tragically died, he took a risk to create a human clone. He hasn't told absolutely anyone about this and tried to hide the child from everyone who would recognize the main character in him, or his twin brother. They are identical. Anyway, the point is that due to social and moral ethics, he couldn't tell the society about his first human cloning. And I think this is the hot debate topic of human cloning due to social and moral concerns, not to mention the possible biological side effects. Of course, in the end, the truth was revealed, and the clone, along with the scientist, just disappeared walking in the desert. So, when I read the aforementioned question, I thought of human cloning as a scientific breakthrough if we chucked ethics out the window. P.S. I strongly recommend watching O Clone, as this telenovela was seriously one of the best TV shows ever, touching on the issues on human cloning, Western versus Eastern cultures, Story 14 biological, remote-controlled human telepresence rigs. Replace chimp eyes with cameras and ears with microphones. Implant kinetic sensors throughout skin and electrodes in muscles. Connect these to a backpack computer. Have the human wear a haptic feedback suit and VR headset. Suspend humans in a Waldo setup. Train chimp to not resist electrode pulses and to assist with balance and fine control. Use chimps for games and sports, combat, dangerous or physically intensive labor, or scientific research tasks in space or other hazardous environments. This should be possible to implement with existing technology. Story 15. A race of genetically modified super-intelligent humans. Or at least that's what I'd do if it were up to me. I am talking about raising the mean IQ by a couple of standard deviations up to about 130. This would be accomplished by expressing a gene which governs neuroplasticity, how well your brain makes new connections and learns. I'm almost certain it would solve all of our problems given good education. We could lower the population by asking people to have 1 or 2 children per couple, and I'm sure we'd be able to solve a lot of other problems too, though population is our main one. I'd also consider making humans much smaller, meaning we'd need less space and less resources to live comfortably. What do you think? How would you change human beings, and do you think a race of super intelligent humans would be a good thing? By the way, everyone would be included in this, no exceptions or master race. Story 16. Being able to transplant humans into another body, including conscious states, habits, emotions, etc. Imagine severe disability or being locked in somehow, yet you're of sound mind and your faculties are intact. What if you could somehow restore from backup into a fresh, fully working body and pick up where you left off? The ethical and moral argument here is, put simply, would you be you? Teleportation is the same. If you're broken down and reassembled at the other end, or are merely copied to the new location, you aren't the original you. That's a real dilemma. That's one of the deepest sci-fi thought experiments. And it really cuts into what identity is. If your consciousness, memories, habits, even quirks were perfectly transplanted into a new body, on the surface it looks like continuity. You feel like yourself. But philosophically, the question is whether you're the original you or just a flawless copy. If the old body dies as the new one boots up, is that a transfer or just replacement? With teleportation, the same paradox arises. The machine destroys the original and reconstructs a perfect version elsewhere. To an outside observer, nothing changes. To the original consciousness, well, there may never be a moment of awareness to even notice the difference. Story 17. Many things, actually. My favorite is the possibility of living eternally. One of the biggest problems with old age is our DNA begins to corrode. With every division, the outer edges of DNA lose pieces and eventually degrade, and the cells die. With stem cells containing a synthetic genome that's the same as ours, we could potentially live forever. True pluripotent stem cells, meaning they can differentiate into any cell our bodies need, would mean we would never run out of cells. We could live forever. I find that just fascinating. Story 18. Hydrogen bomb electricity generation. Hydrogen bombs can be detonated periodically in large, water-filled salt domes, salt deposits that formerly contained oil, to generate steam, which can then be used to generate electricity. This would be a reliable method for producing fusion power using existing technology. Salt domes are airtight, self-repairing, and self-sealing because salt flows together and seals any cracks under intense geological pressures. Helium reserves are contained in salt domes for this reason. This would prevent the mass escape of any radioactive fallout due to leakage or progressive weakening of the structure. Story 19. Much better research data on safety and effectiveness. I read somewhere that a lot of drug trials are entered by folks who are professional lab rats. You can make enough money to live off if you sign up for a lot of trials. And understandably, this leads some people to do it. Selecting people at random and forcing them to submit to drug trials will give you much better data than a self-selected sample of people who have been through lots of other drug trials in the past and may be undergoing multiple trials concurrently. I read somewhere else that this is one of the nightmare scenarios with creating a superhuman artificial intelligence without ethical safeguards, and then turning it loose on a medical problem. For example, the most efficient, ethics-free way to cure cancer would be creating robot death squads to kidnap random civilians, radiate them to give them cancer, and then inject them with test meds until you find a cure. Story 20. Tuberculosis research. This is mostly because tuberculosis is a unique disease, both because of the bacteria that causes it and how humans react to it. Tuberculosis is caused by a mycobacterium named, rather aptly, Mycobacterium tuberculosis. These bacteria have a thick, waxy layer of lipids on their membranes, which prevents a lot of antibiotics from killing them. This means that we only have a few meds that can properly treat TB, and they need to be administered for at least 6 months. And these meds are pretty nasty. One of the first line meds, rifampicin, is severely hepatotoxic and actually turns your sweat, urine, and tears orange, which is harmless, thank God. What makes treated tuberculosis in humans unique is that we react to it differently from mice. When tuberculosis bacteria infect our lungs, our immune system tries to end it immediately by engulfing the bacteria with macrophages. Unfortunately, TB bacteria live and replicate inside of macrophages, so another layer of macrophages and other immune cells are recruited to form a multi-celled barrier surrounding the infected zones. At this point, the infection can go two ways: latent or active. Latent TB is the most common form. Up to 90% of people infected with TB stay in this phase until they die of other causes, as well as the reason why 1/3 of the world's population is infected with TB. Story 21. Superpowers, better brain power, and solutions to common problems. I honestly think morality and ethics is holding back scientific progress because we pretend that living life within certain belief systems is more important than fixing things that are causing us harm or killing us right now. If we always fear that playing God would lead to us going to hell all the time, then we'll never make progress as a civilization. A lot of our scientific breakthroughs in the past would have been considered witchcraft or black magic by close-minded people. We should let those who have the courage to experiment and be experimented on do what they think is right. We won't lose anything. If there's some kind of entity that hates people playing God, then they would be the ones punished. If there's no such thing as a jealous or easily provoked entity, then the entirety of mankind would benefit with their discoveries. If I were rich enough, I'd go fund secret research into things that would improve our living conditions. If something important and beneficial is discovered, I'd go release it to the world as free information. Nobody gets the cookie in the fridge by staying scared of the boogeyman. Story 22. Eugenics. It's already happening naturally to a certain extent with highly intelligent, highly successful people breeding with similar, and at the other end of the spectrum, people without a full deck or other negative genetic predispositions breeding with the same. The problem is that the first group either doesn't breed at all or they have one or two kids, while the other end of the spectrum might spawn half a dozen or more. We could probably cut violent crime considerably by selective sterilization. I've heard they're already doing something along these lines in China, but within a single couple's embryos, genetically selecting the best. That's a heavy one. Eugenics has always lived in this uncomfortable gray zone between theoretically reducing suffering and historically being used as a justification for atrocities. You're right that natural selection of partners already creates a kind of soft eugenics. People with certain traits cluster together, and wealth, intelligence, and even health outcomes get passed down unevenly. But the suggestion of selective sterilization to curb crime crosses into really dark ethical territory because who decides what traits are undesirable? History shows us how quickly that kind of power gets abused. Story 23. A lot of these are pure speculation without any evidence. Here's an actual, albeit very odd one. The human Z. Surprising as it may be, we do not actually know whether a human and chimpanzee could produce offspring. There are cases of animals with similar degrees of genetic and phenotypic distance being able to do so. So, it is not all that implausible. If we were really serious about chucking the whole ethics thing, then it would not be too hard to finally give this question a comprehensive answer. And if it turns out it is possible, who knows what the creature would be like? It could resemble a super strong human, a human with low intelligence. Maybe it could even be smarter than us. These things are not very predictable. Story 24. Immortality from brain uploading. If you have sentient brains, which can tell you if your extremely invasive brain-neutral neuron-level chimera interfaces are working or not, that would really help you iterate your design of neutron-level chimera interfaces. The subjects would probably not be very willing to help, but once the operations had been performed, it would be in people's self-interest not to lie about results in the hope they're the first prototype who can be salvaged. At least one person in 100 would not be spiteful or insane enough to talk probably. Though it would be simpler to just relax restrictions on human experiments and ask for volunteers. That would probably be more efficient because happy volunteers are cooperative volunteers. And it's less evil. Story 25. I'm amused at how the top comments aren't stating the obvious. With plastic surgery, an elective invasive surgery being a billion-dollar business, obviously one of the first things we'd succumb to is superficial genetic modification. People are going to make sure their kids are cute. And more importantly, people are going to want to find ways to fix themselves, whether it's different hormone treatments or other ways to manipulate their bodies, to meet desirable ideals. I really believe there would be people who would genetically choose what their kids would look like, or at least won't look like. All it would take is for a few celebrities to do that with good results. And suddenly it's a social disadvantage to leave your kid's DNA entirely up to chance as it is now. But good thing we have ethics and morals and yada yada, basic human rights. I just hope this doesn't prevent stem cell research for treating the important things like diseases, like other people mentioned here. Story 26. City on Mars? Hell of a death count before that happens, I would think. This probably wouldn't be a popular one. I would think mental disorders would somewhat leap forward too. People are slowly learning to accept that, for the most part, it's uncontrollable, and there's some research suggesting that our brains are affected by it too, so that people can be more susceptible to those illnesses than others. Treatment is moving away from meds, which I guess is a good thing, because they are addictive and do not always work. Can you separate those features from what makes the drug work? I'm not sure. So maybe there's a way for those meds to work without being addicted, or having to up the dosage over time. The ethical part is the potential outcome of the program, particularly with taking their life tendencies. What does that do to a person when they leave a program that works to help them feel better and normal and found that it didn't work for them? I think that going away from those meds is a double-edged sword. It's good because now you're encouraging the mind to heal itself without meds. But I can't help but wonder if the meds which are now banned or newly developed have done so based on the evolution of our brain that caused the drug to be ineffective over generations, mother to offspring. Hell of a short time to evolve this much, though.